We're going to tag team. Our presentation is going to be a little bit different than the other presentations that you've seen, and hopefully, given that it might be a little bit different, it could start to tease out some of the areas where we agree and disagree and start putting some alternatives in front of the board for its consideration on things that may or may not work in the Delta. So there's some policy.
Normally you're at
What?
Normally you're at the podium in front of the microphone,
No, I know. Sorry.
threatening to sue me or something that you're very impassioned about. On that one, you have to sit right in front of it, or I won't be able to hear you. And I do want to hear you.
Thank you. I'm Tim O'Laughlin. I'm Chief Counsel for the San Joaquin Tributaries Association. With me today is Doug Demko. Doug is a fishery biologist. In his firm, he has 40 employees, both in the U.S. and internationally. Doug's been working on the tributaries, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, the Merced, and the San Joaquin River for over 20 years. Most of that time has been spent in the field, leading numerous research projects and extensive fish monitoring. He has conducted on behalf of the various districts and public agencies the rotary screw trapping on the rivers. He's also came up with the idea to install the Vica weir, which we now have on the tributaries, to look at the amount of salmonids moving in and out and what other fish are moving in and out. He's worked with acoustic and radio telemetry and probably, as far as I know, has the most experience on the ground of anybody in the San Joaquin River Basin as a fishery biologist. His office also has been doing work in Southeast Asia. He's currently working and researching fishery declines in the Mekong Delta on behalf of the United States State Department and the USGS. So he'll be joining me today to go through our presentation. A couple years ago, the legislature tasked you with coming up with a flow criteria report. You did that report, and the flow criteria, without going through all of it, basically a summary fashion is the full protection of fish and wildlife beneficial uses requires 60% of the unimpaired flow from the San Joaquin River. Now, it seems to me that in the discussions that we've been having here over the last several days is there are alternatives that face the board as the board moves forward based on the science that you've been receiving about what it is you can be doing. So one of them is you could say, okay, the flow criteria report protects public trust and reasonable benefit, public trust resources 100% of the time. We're going to not weigh and balance other competing needs, even though you may have to. Some people would say that. And we're going to adopt 60% unimpaired flow, and we're going to go with that. And you could do that. You'd have to do a little work, but you could do it. The next one is that if you don't do that, you're going to have to come up with something that if 60% of the unimpaired flow protects the public trust resources 100% of the time, at what less flow, what public resources are you protecting? And really, that's the question for the board. And unfortunately, as we've sat here over the last several days, it seems to me we haven't had a very frank discussion about what it is that we can and can't do to protect public trust resources, and at what levels and at what benefits we hope to achieve based on the water costs that we would be looking at. So in our view of the world, the proposition for the board is, as you've currently set it up on the San Joaquin River, is at what % of unimpaired flow are you going to get Y benefit to protect fish and wildlife resources in the tributaries, San Joaquin River and Southern Delta? So your current goal, as expressed in your draft, was you were going to improve the natural production. Well, actually, we're going to double the natural production of Chinook salmonids in the San Joaquin River Basin. That's your goal. We have some other ideas for you, maybe. And we think maybe more specific goals are more appropriate without getting into the whole debate about natural production versus hatchery fish versus what the baseline was and what it wasn't, but what are some goals that we might look at it being achieved in the San Joaquin River Basin in the southern delta. So we broke it down to increase juvenile survival in the tributaries, increase juvenile survival in the delta, increase ocean abundance, which may be a factor of the two up above, increase freshwater returns, and then the last one we looked at is increase the natural or wild fish abundance in the San Joaquin River Basin. So when we go through this analysis, you're going to hear those themes come back time and time again about what goals we think we can achieve based on a more focused goal or objective. So when we went down and heard your workshop was coming, we talked over the last 3 months, and we've come up with the following. We're going to put in front of you alternatives for increased spring flows. We would recommend that you install the headed old river barrier. We would support a predator suppression program, and we'll talk about that. Improve habitat, and that's going to be a tough one, but we can define some areas where we might be able to improve habitat. And then we go with a, we kind of lumped this together. It was a difficult one, but a mark select fishery combined with harvest, and then we're looking at an exclusion type of weir operation where on the San Joaquin we would keep hatchery fish out of the tributaries that do not have hatcheries. So that'd be keep hatchery fish out of the Stanislaus and Tuolumne if you wanted to look at that. And then our last suggestion is, as you heard earlier from Chuck and Mr. Kramer, we got to do something about ocean harvest depending on what your goal is. So our 4 proposals for spring pulse flows is that we increase spring pulse flows to 10,000 CFS or above for a period of number of days at Vernalis. We went with we took 30% unimpaired. We realized you have a range of between 20 and 60%. We didn't want to take 20 and we didn't want to take 60, so we ended up at 30. Realized people can look at that differently and put 40 or 45 in.
Is that where the science comes in?
Well, we'll talk about the science in a bit. Yeah, yeah, science. Dry year relief is a concept or idea where you try to do more in the first year of a first dry year or 2 sequential dry years. It may not get you through a 28 through 34 period, but the idea or concept is to try to make these intermediate dry, below normal, and critical years better. And then the last one is a volume concept where you come up with a block of water, make it available in the springtime, and then see what you can do between tributary coordination and various pulse flows on the tributaries to achieve certain objectives. The goal of the increased pulse flows is to increase salmon smolt survival through the tributaries and delta. And then Doug can take over from here.
So first of all, thank you and good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And as Tim mentioned, I do have a lot of practical on-the-ground experience. I've been involved in fisheries in the Central Valley for about 23 years and probably 20 years on the San Joaquin Basin, performing a variety of research and monitoring projects. So I hope to bring a kind of a practical, hands-on approach to our discussion today. And I want to start with the easy topic of flow, because I heard some things yesterday. We saw a lot of graphs and heard some comments about the standard equation of more flow equals more fish. And I've been hearing this for quite a few years, and I still remain kind of unconvinced that it's as simple as more flow making more fish. And this is a discussion that I think has been going on for all of my career, for more than my career, for 25 plus years. Probably the single most researched issue, at least in the San Joaquin Basin. Millions of dollars have been put into trying to find a relationship between flow and survival of smolts moving out of the San Joaquin Basin. We're talking millions of hatchery CWT releases and millions of dollars being spent over a 25-year effort. So it's a considerable effort. And I would point to and want to review what I would think are, or what I believe are probably the three key studies that review this work. Baker Morhart in 2001. These are two, I think, well-respected biologists. They reviewed all of the pre-VAMP data. Newman in 2008, I believe, he's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service PhD level statistician. I'm not sure of that, but that was a CalFed funded project to review past studies and the CWT, the VAMP data. And then in Dobble in 2010, it was Dobble et al. Included David Hankin at the university, or at Humboldt. Was a peer review panel that was put together specifically to evaluate the previous studies and the VAMP data. So three key studies looking back at that 25 years of data. The first one, Baker Morhart in 2001. The purpose was as a summary of the understanding of our relationships between river flow, exports, and Chinook survival through the Delta. That's the key question that those 25 years of studies are attempting to answer. The first finding is the relationship between flow and survival was not well quantified within the managed flow range. So there's no relationship based on those pre-VAMP CWT releases between flow and survival. He also found no relationship between survival and export rates. And the choice of emigration route has a dramatic effect on smolt survival, twice as high through the San Joaquin River compared to the old river. And I think this is a theme that we're going to see again and again and again. More so than flow, you can double survival just by looking at the migration route, by keeping fish in the San Joaquin River, keeping them out of Old River. He also identified that there were serious knowledge gaps about our understanding of Chinook and how they travel through the Delta, which is still true today. Fish are difficult animals to research. They live in water. They live in the Delta in turbid water, so they're not easy to see and they're not easy to track. Newman in 2008, again, this was I believe is a well-respected PhD statistician. This was a CalFed project. This was a reanalysis or a reevaluation of the VAMP data using more sophisticated statistical techniques, but its conclusions were consistent with Baker Morhart in 2001 and other published reports, agency reports, annual type reports. He also said the installation of head of Old River barrier can increase survival. And again, there's little evidence for the association between exports and survival. So his 2008 report was similar, the results were similar to Baker Morhart in 2001. So then we get to near the end of VAMP, and Dobble et al. Was put together as a VAMP peer review panel to specifically look back at the reports, look at the data and see if there were any need for some re-evaluation of the data. And again, we're looking at the same issues, relationship between flows, exports, and head of Old River barrier operation and how they influence survival. He said that simply meeting, or I should say they said, simply meeting certain flow objectives at Vernalis is unlikely to achieve consistent rates of smolt survival through the Delta. So 25 years of CWT releases, of acoustic tag releases, 25 years of effort, and we're finding again from this peer review panel that flow objectives at Vernalis aren't likely to get us what we want in terms of increasing smolt survival through the Delta. Also said that Delta hydraulics and the high and likely highly variable impacts of predation appear to affect survival more than river flow. And he had the advantage now in 2010 of having the updated CWT study plan when they switched from CWTs to acoustic tags. And we've talked a little bit about those yesterday, provide a little bit higher resolution data, real-time data. You can actually see locations where fish are lost. So now he's attributing predation more important to flow. And then again, third time we've seen this, the desire to reduce or eliminate downstream passage through Old River. 25 years of data, and again, we're finding the same thing, that Old River, when fish go into the South Delta, that's a challenge for them. Keeping fish in the San Joaquin River, it's a shorter route past Stockton and out to the bay, improves survival more than anything else. So one of the challenges that we've had, the San Joaquin Trib Association, we look back at the 2010 and 2012 board reports, is there seems to be an under-reliance on 3 reports that we just discussed, and what we think is an over-reliance on the 2005 California Department of Fish and Game fall run Chinook model. And we submitted extensive written comments about that model in 2010. We also were at the hearings in 2010 and brought a PhD level professor statistician to discuss his evaluation, his critiques of that 2005 fall run Chinook model. But we still haven't seen in the updated 2000 report, we still see what we think is an over-reliance on not the best available science and an under-reliance on what we think is the best science, and we can support that. That's the Baker-Morhart 2001, Newman 2008, and the Dobble et al. In 2010.
Well, and actually, on that slide, this is something that drives my policy people crazy, and it's a question posed to the board and to the board staff, which is, you say you're going to use the best available science, and you want us to put the best available science in. So we think we send it to you, and you get it, but it's not put in your report, which is your technical appendice. So we made a big deal about that, and we wanted that question resolved, which is, why are you relying on the model, the Fish and Game model, A, when they showed up at a hearing and said that their model was no good, that they had to go back and redo it again. Nobody else in any Bay Delta proceeding is using the California Department of Fish and Game model currently, and yet everybody cites to it, and your report relies almost extensively on that model, and it's a progeny, kind of the fruit of the poisonous tree. You see this citation back to Messick and Marston back in 2005, and then you see these little cites further on by Messick and Marston and other people, but they all cite back to the same thing. So as we go forward in the process, what our policy people want to see from the board and the board staff is a response to our request. If our science isn't good, tell us why it isn't. But currently, we've received nothing from you. And that's an important point, and we're going to bring it up in the 3rd workshop. Next slide.
So when we look at scientific certainty with regard to what we found over the years with the flow survival, we see that high unmanaged spring flood flows may increase salmon survival through the Delta. And I think Baker and Morhart in 2001 hit this one accurately. It's over 18,000 CFS was their best estimate, because there were no data points between 11 and 18,000 CFS. And we also think that it's obvious that without the head of Old River barrier in place, there's no significant relationship between spring flows in the managed range, and I believe Baker and Morhart cited that as 6,000 to 7,000 CFS, and Smoltz Survival through the Delta.
So I'm going to run through some flow proposals for you for consideration, where you can start thinking about the trade-offs that you as policy people will need to be making determinations on, and how you have to interplay certain benefits and certain trade-offs that will occur under certain flow regimes. So the first one is 10,000 CFS for 14 days. This will not create floodplain habitat in the tributaries. So on the tributaries, we submitted to you previously under our unsolicited comment section in your State Board website a report on this. And when you get to 10,000, it's right about there that you might start encroaching on the floodplains, 3, 3, and 3, to get out on the floodplains and the tributaries. You will create some floodplain habitat in the lower San Joaquin River, and we're going to go through that. And Mr. Kane made a presentation to you yesterday, And actually, we hijacked almost all of his work and incorporated it into our presentation here today to discuss with you. But here's the thing. Even at 10,000 CFS, under what Mr. Kane described and what our own report that we submitted in 2010 confirms, is that the benefits are about you'll get 1,500 acres plus or minus of floodplain habitat below Vernalis in the San Joaquin River by 10,000 CFS at 14 days. So do 10,000 times 2 is 20,000 acre feet, times 14 days is 280,000 acre feet for 1,500 acres of floodplain. I don't want to get in a big dispute with Mr. Kane about, you know, I don't have to prove to you the benefits of floodplain habitat. Well, actually, somebody does. And here's the statement, okay? The problem is floodplain habitat has ecological benefits across the board. But when you're in this process and your goal is you're going to be setting goals to protect reasonable and beneficial uses, the question is it going to increase salmon smolt survival? Is it going to increase salmon smolt abundance? Is it going to increase abundance in the ocean? Is it going to have a population impact? Are we going to see more fish returning in 3 years by having this type of floodplain habitat? So floodplain habitat for floodplain habitat is, I understand the ecosystem interplay, but if you're looking at protecting reasonable and beneficial uses, you need to know exactly what you're going, or what you think you're going to get. One of the bad things at 10,000 CFS is you can't install and operate the head of Old River Barrier. The head of Old River Barrier it's normally installed at less than 7,000. It can operate up to about a maximum of 7,500, and then you have to take it out. And that has benefits, which we'll go through later on. Now, you may lower, based on the computer modeling that we've done and submitted to you, both in the 303D process for water temperature and in regards to your 2010 report, at higher flows above 10,000, you may lower water temperatures on the tributaries, and you may lower them for a duration of time in a downstream longitudinal direction. But you're not going to lower water temperatures on the San Joaquin, and you're certainly not going to lower water temperatures in the Delta. And our computer modeling we gave you showed that. You may increase turbidity. The rivers all have different kind of shears points on the rivers. So you may increase turbidity slightly at 10,000, but conversely, we can go stick a fire hose in a river and create turbidity. And one of the funny things I'll have to say here as an aside, it's kind of interesting to me, having fought with your regional board for the last 15 years about a dissolved oxygen objective in the Deepwater Ship Channel. Actually, you folks have a TMD, well, you don't, but your regional board does, that algae, nutrients, and phytoplanktons are pollutants and are causing a DO sag in the Deepwater Ship Channel, and that you allocated 1/3 of that problem to us on the upstream portion of the river because we had nutrients, phytoplankton, and algae coming downstream. So that was a bad thing. So you beat us up on that. Now we hear here that, you know, you actually want nutrients and you want phytoplankton and you want algae and you want turbidity. Well, we also have a turbidity TMDL as well on the upstream. So we're getting whipsawed. If you want it, we're happy to give it to you, but you can't tell us that we're the cause and ask for increased flow and then say that it's these other issues. So currently you have that TMDL out there that's in effect, and you'd have to change your TMDL if you want more phytoplankton and things to get into the river. The other thing that wasn't discussed in that section as well in regards to increasing turbidity as well as phytoplankton and algae, we submitted to you previously a study done by Susan Paulson. Unfortunately, and we submitted an extensive report and a peer-reviewed report on the dissolved oxygen objective. Two things happen. One is when the phytoplankton and algae gets to about the head of Old River Barrier, given the diversions in the delta, it splits apart and basically disappears. So it never shows up, and that was one of our points, that we shouldn't be responsible for 1/3 of the problem, since our phytoplankton and algae never showed up because it just gets dispersed by these diversions. The other part is, even if it gets to the delta, 98% of the water from the San Joaquin River under managed flow conditions never makes it to the bay. 98%. Okay, so if you're looking to move phytoplankton, algae, and all this other stuff into the southern delta and across the southern delta, then diversions in the deltas are going to have to change. And all the diversions will have to change, including those by the farmers, because it gets consumed in the southern delta. The problem with 10,000 CFS for 14 days, given with other flow options, is that you will have significant impacts. We modeled this under your 60% diversion, 60% unimpaired. You'll have significant water diversions and reservoir storage impacts. Next slide. So you, at 10,000 plus, you can create limited floodplain habitat. And if you do, you should describe what exactly the benefits you're going to get from that limited floodplain habitat as offset against the water costs that you will be incurring. And it's questionable about whether or not you will increase salmon smolt survival through the delta. So the next one we looked at was 30% unimpaired flow. Needless to say, it makes sense that in wetter years you're going to put more water down the stream. Conversely, when the hydrology gets drier below normal, you're going to put less water down the stream. And the problem here is it's kind of a boom-bust cycle, because you'll be putting more water down, but you won't be able to carry water over. And if you don't carry water over, you're not going to be able to offset the impacts from dry years or successive dry years. We submitted a report. I know nobody likes what we submitted, but it is that at the low or no flow variability, you will have low or no flow variability at 30% unimpaired. And there's a reason for that. What happens is you have caps that are already included within your design. So on each river, you have a maximum amount of water that can be released on a daily basis. Then you go with a percentage. So a percentage smooths the unimpairedness of what you're trying to do. And then additionally, you have an operational constraint, because you're not going to be changing it every day. So you're going to have come up with a 7 to 15 day averaging period, which smooths it. Then with the travel time and trying to get someplace downstream, you basically have little or no variation. And so we sent you that report and that study previously as well. The problem with 30%, you'll get no floodplain habitat on the tributaries, or in the San Joaquin or in the South Delta. None of the 30%, given the caps that you've installed, will create any floodplain habitat if you're looking to do that. The other problem with the 30% that you've put in, which is a trade-off, and this was talked about in other reports, you have water going from February through June, and we put out a paper to you that in June you have difficulty because there's little or no salmon smolts left in the tribs, and the question is, we have this huge water cost in June of pushing fish out in June. So if you're looking to move fish out in June, it has a huge water cost, and you're looking at protecting 1 or 2% of the fish. I've heard the biologists talk about, you know, we need to protect the fish all the time through this time period. Your problem is going to be, is given the limited amount of water supply you have to deal with, plus the trade-offs, can you protect the fish in that entire time period? Because the next one is in February, you're looking at unimpaired flows as well, and you heard earlier a question about whether or not it makes sense to send fry and par down to a delta that's not very hospitable to fisheries, especially salmonids, in the February time period. We did an analysis. We sent it to you on the 2010. When you look at water temperatures will not change at 30% unimpaired. They will not change. You will get little or no improvement, and if you do, it's going to be in the tributaries, and it's going to be for the first 5 miles or so. It's very limited. You'll get no improvement in dissolved oxygen or change. You'll get no change in turbidity. You'll get no change in geomorphology. So what I thought was interesting yesterday was a gentleman was talking about, you know, habitat and describing, you know, what kind of habitat, and don't just say habitat. Say specifically what you mean you're going to get. And actually EPA, and you'll see a quote here later on in our presentation, says that as well, which is if you go with the unimpaired flow paradigm, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you do, from EPA's perspective, you should have quantifiable, measurable functionalities that you think you're going to achieve. And if you don't achieve any of the functionalities, the question is, what is the benefit from the unimpaired flow? The last one is what the conclusion is that we tried to find a benefit that we could put assigned to unimpaired flow other than just saying unimpaired flow. And given the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, Merced, and San Joaquin rivers and the Southern Delta in the highly altered state, we see no benefit of unimpaired flow in a highly altered system. And that was what your panel said back in 2010, which is putting water down in a highly unimpaired, highly altered system makes little or no sense. Next one. So we come up with a couple other ones for you to consider. This is a volume. Go back one. Isn't there one before this? Okay, go forward one more. There. I want to talk about dry year relief first, and then go back to volume. NRC, when they came out with their report, said dry years are particularly of concern to the fishery resources and the public trust resources. So what we tried to do is look at it at dry, critical dry, and below normal years. And if you can imagine hydrology, you'll have a wet year, you might have a below normal year, you'll have a dry year, then you'll have an average year. So the goal was to come up with an indice where we could try to push more water into those initial dry year periods and see if we could, how much we could bump up the hydrograph in those periods, trying to provide benefits to fishery resources and not impact long-term operations, storage, or diversions. And what we were looking at is an April-May pulse flow, but it could be operated. If you came up with dry year relief, it kind of works well with volumes of water, i.e. you would come up with a block of water and then you would manage that water in the April-May pulse flow period. I think everybody that we've dealt with over the last 10 years feels pretty confident that this 1,500 CFS for 31 days really doesn't do a lot biologically for anything, and that you need to have higher variable pulse flows and to try to do those. Now we do draw the reservoirs down in the first year or two, but what happens with the hydrology is when it rains, basically you take that out of flood flows that would have occurred later in the year or successive years, provides more water with minimal impacts to diversions in hydropower. Now the bad news, when you look at this, it has 3 to 5 years. If you go to an 87 through 92 drought, or you go through a 28 through 34 drought, if you provide substantially more water in the first several years, the last several years don't look too good because the reservoir is drawn down dramatically more than where it might have been before. So the shortages may become a little bit more severe. And then go back. And then we come up with a volume concept. This is, you come up with a volume of water, and you can base it on what is in the reservoir as of pick a date, March 15th, April 1st. You look at projected runoff. We're pretty good about projected runoff in the basin. You would assign some percentage of that, and then you would come up with pulse flows based on an indice of that, or a volume of water, and you would manage it differently. So in dry or below normal years or critical years, you may look at moving your water earlier. You may have less pulse flows over time. You may have 1 to 3 pulse flows in a shorter duration of time, because what we found is that if you try to move water in May and drier year types, water temperatures are already elevated. And just so you know, we did not factor into any of this analysis any of the San Joaquin River restoration flows, which we believe will have significant impacts on water temperature on the San Joaquin. But that's what happens in those years. And then in above normal and wet years, you would look to provide from March through May 3 to 5 pulse flows. You can coordinate them on the tributaries if you could, and provide those flows. And then you could do it with a hybrid with the dry year relief and try to see if you can bump up the dry years with blocks of water. So the goal would be is to provide more flow variations in the tribs in the San Joaquin River. This has an ability to diminish impacts to diversions, but not to hydropower. So the goal is that when you start sequentially moving through these things and looking at what various flow proponents or flow components look like, you have to then move downstream and see what benefits you're going to receive from those various flow components and what the functionality of that flow is, and then have something that's measurable and quantifiable as a resource goal. Those are 4 of them. There's other alternatives out there, but that's kind of the thinking process from the board's perspective that you need to start going through. Is there a question? Go ahead.
So, but on the first 2, you said we kind of what we wouldn't get in terms of Smoltz Survival and other, the turbidity and other benefits on the block of water, the volume,
Right.
And on the on your
Right.
dry year scenario, what are we going to get from your perspective?
Well, my perspective is that anything in the managed flow condition, you're probably going to see little or no differentiation in salmon smolt survival in the delta, no matter what you do. So, I mean, I don't want to be flippant about it, but it's really, I mean, if you look at the science that's out there, if you look at 7,000 CFS or below, you cannot tease out what type of benefit you're going to get for smolt survival. And you're not going to tease it out for escapement. You're not going to tease it out for abundance or population. There's just nothing there. So the problem for you now as a board member is, are there other things that you may want to look at? So dry year relief. So you do get some additional cold water temperature benefits in dry years that may not have been there with lower flow conditions. You may think that we might get some, with higher pulse flows, we might be able to move fish better or provide a better impetus for them to move. But in reality, if you look at the underlying factors, and this is what's kind of at the managed flow conditions, if water temperature really doesn't change and nutrients don't change and the food for the fish doesn't change and predation remains static because moving flows around really doesn't change predation that much, and if you look at dissolved oxygen and you look at all the factors that would affect fish, I think the reason we don't see any change in salmon smolt survival is because none of the flow functionality changes in the managed condition. That's why I think when you look at flows above 10,000 and higher, you can start to tease out some of these things because you can look that turbidity increases. You can look that water temperatures remain colder further downstream. You can look at, I don't think, when you look at the literature, salmonids are volitional swimmers. They swim faster than the current for the most part. You'd have to pump down a lot of water to make them go out quicker, especially on the San Joaquin. But you can see some indications there where things get better. But under managed flow conditions, you don't see it. So what happens under managed flow conditions is there's really no change in functionality. It's a question of moving fish out. And even at that, with predation rates where they are and ocean harvest rates, those totally overwhelm anything you could hope to desire to get at a board level with flow. And you'll see that as we move forward.
So the summary we have for increasing spring flows, the scientific certainty we think is the lowest of all the alternatives that we're going to present to you. The feasibility is low, especially given the significant costs and the time to implement. And as we were talking about with those 25 years of studies that were intended to find a relationship between flow and survival, there's just no relationship. The next one that we want to talk about, next alternative action, is installing the head of Old River. And this is kind of a unique perspective. It's looking south from the air. You can see the San Joaquin River flowing north, and when you get to the confluence with Old River, fish have a choice here, and they either go right, they stay in the San Joaquin River and go to Stockton, and we know from repeated experiments that that's the preferred route for them, that survival doubles by staying in the San Joaquin River. If they go left, they get into the South Delta. So a barrier there at the head of Old River would serve to keep fish in the San Joaquin and improve the survival out of the San Joaquin. The goal here is to increase salmon smolt survival through the Delta. There's lots of evidence out there. We didn't want to do this one to death. This is a quote from Nymphs, and it just says, combined increase in survival of 9% represents a doubling of the survival chances. And like I said, in the literature, it's well established that head of old river barrier would dramatically improve conditions, survival for juvenile Chinook salmon migrating out of the San Joaquin River. So our summary here is just install the physical head of old river to increase salmon smolt survival. The scientific certainty is very high. The feasibility is high. There's an annual cost to install it. Until a permanent one is in there. It can be done under 7,000 CFS, and actually it might be installing, it might be under 5,000 CFS, and the result is an immediate increase in survival of smolts moving out of the system. So predation 2 is another one. We didn't bring a lot of information on predation because we thought a couple of things. Number one, it's been done to death. We started, the San Joaquin Trib Association started pounding on this issue about 10 years ago, and I think when you look at the anecdotal evidence for the significant impacts of predation, it goes back for decades. We put this slide in there because Tim had mentioned to me that somebody at one of the earlier proceedings had said that striped bass, big fish, don't eat big fish. They just eat the little smolts. And this is a case, an angler caught this fish in the Stanislaus River. It's a rainbow trout that they took out of the stomach. And I can tell you there were 2 instances in my career where I caught striped bass electrofishing that had fish that were so large that the tails were actually hanging out of their stomachs. So they will eat fish too large to eat head first, and then they just digest them over time. So the history, without doing it to death, again, there's a long and well-documented predation history in the South Delta. This is a picture we took one evening at the federal diversion facilities, and for ESA purposes, for their permits out there, the estimated loss rate is 15. The pre-screen loss rates are 15%, but we know from the acoustic tracking with VAMP, there's actually a lot more loss going on in the area than just that 15%. And when you go a little bit north to the intake for the state facilities, the Clifton Court estimates are 85%, and that's just the average they use of a decade of studies, and some of the studies are, 100% loss. So,
well, and on that, I mean, in Clifton Court, you have to imagine that you go into Clifton Court, there's 600,000 to 1 million striped bass and stripers sitting in there waiting to eat you before you get to the screens. So that's why mortality is so high.
Yeah, and that's just in Clifton Court, and then you've got problems with the salvage methods that are used, and then they release those fish, and they're preyed on where they're released. So it's just a really, really bad situation. It's been ongoing and overlooked for a very long time. So we brought this one quote from Nymphs recovery plan that says, to restore anadromous salmonids, have to significantly reduce the non-native predatory fishes that inhabit the lower river reaches in the delta to prevent extinction or prevent the species from declining irreversibly. So again, I think there's total buy-off on the predation issue, how bad it is, how bad it has been, and the fact that it's something needs to be done over that. And it's really long
Doug,
overdue.
we've had discussions with Tim and others about predation hotspots. I mean, it was very clear that when Fish and Game Commission ruled on the striped bass issue and predation that they weren't going to certainly tackle it very broadly. After that, there were conversations about concentrating on known hotspots. Is there any progress, in your opinion, that's being made there, or is there any validity to the fact that that could not provide total relief, but provide a degree of significant relief?
So the question is focusing on hotspots enough? I would have to say, in my opinion, no. I would have to say that would be a good start, but I think predation, again, looking at decades of anecdotal evidence and studies, that certainly hotspots are a problem, but I think it's more ubiquitous than that. And I'd point to this slide, which is the Stanislaus River. And I know when I go back to the start of my career, I was told stripers inhabited, the delta. And one of the key findings that we've learned from this weir on the Stanislaus River, which we initially put in just to enumerate and learn about how adults migrate upstream in responses to changes in river flow, was we started seeing stripers come through. And we had actually been seeing them in snorkel surveys upstream as well, so they knew that they were in the river. So we started leaving the weir in through springtime, and I think we've got 4 years of that type of data now, and we see a heavy migration in some years upstream in the spring. It peaks in April and May when the smolts are moving out. We know that they're moving upstream and downstream in the river year-round. I think the 2 months that there's only 1 or 2 data points would be December and January, so the coldest, wettest months. We don't see a lot of movement, but we also know that through snorkel surveys, they're inhabiting the river up to Knight's Ferry, which is only 4 or 5 miles below the dam, and we know from our Omicus research that that's the prime area. That's Omicus habitat. It's it's high gradient, it's very cold water. It's the habitat that Omicus prefer, and here we also have a striped bass living in there year-round. I don't know how active they are, and I don't know how predatory they are during those months, but they're certainly in the river year-round.
Well, and to follow up on the question, just more on the policy side, actually there's been little or no movement in that direction. So we're pushing an agenda to try to, and you'll see it here in a bit, to try to get installed a predator seclusion zone to see if we can start generating the type of data and results and suppression that's needed to try to get more smolts out to the San Joaquin River.
And in 2011, we finally made some headway. This was a success for us because, again, we've been pounding on the table about this one. This is a quote from Fish and Game regarding their proposal to change the angling regulations for striped bass, and they admitted that it's a substantial predator and it contributes to the poor survival of young salmon in the lower tributaries and the delta as well. It's interesting to note, and this issue came up yesterday about predator suppression programs and are they effective and is there a good model? And there's an excellent model, and it's ironic that this has been employed on the Columbia system for over 20 years, and we took this quote out of that same Fish and Game report. And they recently did a review of the Columbia system, and what they do there is they pay anglers to harvest pike minnow, which is a native predator, but it's they've identified it's a problem due to the changes in the system, due to hydropower development around structures. They have a better opportunity to prey on salmonids. So 20 years ago, they started paying people to harvest them, and they've determined in a 20-year review that the predation rate has gone down almost 40%. 40%. That's an incredible reduction in predation rate just by paying anglers. And the cost of the program, I forget offhand, but it's relatively small. They also did a cost effectiveness evaluation of this, and they learned that the money that the program costs, they actually get back in benefits to local communities by having those increased adult returns. So it's
all the beer the fishermen are buying in the local stores, or what?
Exactly.
Well, some of these guys make $45,000 a year fishing for pike minnow.
Yeah. So
you can do that when you retire, Charlie.
and the key with this is they also found that other predators don't move in to occupy, that's something that we've heard cited for the last 4 or 5 years, that if we take striped bass out, other predators are going to compensate and move in, or the smaller striped bass are going to grow larger, but they haven't, in a 20-year review on the Columbia system, they haven't found that at all. This would be one of those programs that's total. When you look at programs and have them, to be able to measure a success at 40% reduction in predation, have it be low cost from the very beginning, and then also have it pay for itself, there aren't too many government programs out there that I think are this successful. So this is ironic that this was a press release on Friday, a joint press release by the Army Corps of Engineers, BPA, and the Bureau, talking about this program, how successful it's been, and the action agencies continue to focus on controlling predation by native and non-native species. So this program has wide support by all the agencies on the Columbia River Basin.
And you asked a question, I think, yesterday, Fran, about whether or not how we can address predation. Well, you have a program of implementation, and in your program of implementation, you can call out specifically to the Fish and Game Commission why they need to do this action. And actually, since you've also found that these introduced species are pollutants, you know, one of the things you can go about is, you know, does it make sense to try to control a pollutant with flow? And so from my perspective, you know, you need to use your bully pulpit and let Fish and Game know that, you know, if they're looking for flows and other things from you in regards to the delta, that those flows may not occur unless they take certain actions, because to release such water may be a waste and unreasonable beneficial use of water to protect public trust resources unless they can get their predator thing under control.
Okay, and this was, in a nutshell, Fish and Game's proposal to raise the daily bag limit from 2 to 6, raise the possession limit, and decrease the minimum size. And I think this is what ultimately was voted down by the commission. And I think this is a start, but really just opening up striped bass season entirely and making no regulations would be more effective than this. But it certainly represents a good start. So to conclude on this, the scientific certainty, the predation by non-native species, especially striped bass, is a major impediment to salmon smolt survival through the lower San Joaquin River and Delta. And, you know, we in the San Joaquin Basin, we measure our smolt production in hundreds of thousands, not in millions. When you look at the Stanislaus River, what's leaving the upper river, in an average year, you might have 150,000 smolt. So we're not talking about having an excess production, having millions of fish. When you're talking about such small numbers and then being able to reduce predation by perhaps 40%, that's really substantial. Evidence from other basins, the Columbia, indicates that predation can be easily and, most importantly, cost-effectively reduced. And a quote from Dauble, the peer review: the high and likely highly variable impacts of predation appear to affect survival rates more than river flow. So again, Dauble was looking at, you know, the 10 or 12 years of VAMP studies and what were the key findings. And here, as much as we all want to pinpoint, you know, we need more flow, flow is the issue. What do we find out? In fact, it's predation, and we think that predation is the easiest and cheapest thing to fix. So different ways of going about this: angler harvest, you know, just opening up the fishing regulations. We could do what they do in the Pacific Northwest, which would actually be paying people to do it, relatively low cost. The hotspot removal, as we talked about, that could be via angling, it could be via electroshocking, gill netting, whatever. I know people cite problems: we can't electroshock, we can't do this, we can't do that. Well, it comes down to we really can't do nothing anymore. And I think some of these, like the exclusion weir that Tim mentioned,